The Charge of the Light Brigade, 1854. During the Crimean War, at the Battle of Balaclava, the British cavalry received a disastrously vague order: charge the Russian guns. The commanders miscommunicated, and the Light Brigade, about 600 cavalrymen, rode straight into a valley lined with Russian artillery on three sides. The result was catastrophic: over 100 soldiers killed, many more wounded, and almost half the unit destroyed. The blunder wasn't about courage. The cavalrymen followed orders with bravery, but the lack of clear communication turned what could have been a strategic maneuver into a near-suicidal attack. This disaster has since become a textbook example of how confusion in the chain of command can lead to unnecessary loss. Napoleon's invasion of Russia, 1812. Napoleon Bonaparte, one of history's greatest generals, committed one of its greatest military mistakes. In 1812, he marched an enormous army, over 600,000 men, into Russia. The campaign initially went well, but the Russians used scorched earth tactics, burning their own towns and crops as they retreated. This denied Napoleon's forces food and shelter. By the time the French army reached Moscow, the city had been abandoned and burned. The brutal Russian winter set in, and supply lines collapsed. Disease, starvation, and the cold decimated Napoleon's troops. Fewer than 100,000 soldiers made it out alive. His failure to anticipate logistics and the severity of the climate turned what could have been a decisive conquest into a historic disaster. The Spanish Armada, 1588. In 1588, Spain launched the mighty Armada, minus 130 ships and thousands of soldiers, to invade England and overthrow Queen Elizabeth I. The Spanish fleet was considered nearly invincible at the time. However, a combination of poor planning, outdated tactics, bad weather, and nimble English ships led to disaster. The English used smaller, faster vessels to outmaneuver the Armada and employed fire ships to scatter it. Storms in the North Sea further destroyed Spanish ships during their retreat. By the end of the campaign, nearly half the fleet was lost. The blunder highlighted the dangers of overconfidence and inadequate adaptation to new naval tactics. Operation Barbarossa, 1941. Adolf Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union in 1941 is often cited as one of the worst strategic mistakes in modern military history. Germany had not yet subdued Britain and was already stretched thin. The German army advanced rapidly at first, capturing vast territories, but Hitler underestimated both the vastness of the Soviet Union and the resilience of its people. As in Napoleon's case, the German army was not prepared for the harsh Russian winter or the long supply lines. Soviet counteroffensives at Moscow and later at Stalingrad turned the tide. Barbarossa opened up a two-front war that Germany could not sustain, leading to its eventual defeat in World War II. Custer's Last Stand, 1876. Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer's overconfidence led to one of the most infamous defeats in American military history. At the Battle of the Little Bighorn, Custer divided his forces into smaller detachments and attacked a much larger Native American force, which included warriors from the Lakota Sioux, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribes. Custer underestimated his enemy's numbers and fighting ability. His detachment of about 200 men was completely overwhelmed and wiped out. The blunder serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of arrogance and inadequate reconnaissance. The Maginot Line, 1940. Before World War II, France invested heavily in the Maginot Line, a massive chain of fortifications along its border with Germany. The French military believed it would prevent another German invasion like the one in World War I. However, the Maginot Line extended only to the Belgian border, leaving the Ardennes forest lightly defended. The Germans simply bypassed the fortifications by invading through Belgium and the Ardennes, rendering the expensive defenses largely useless. This blunder demonstrated the risk of preparing for the last war instead of anticipating future tactics, such as Germany's fast-moving blitzkrieg strategy. The Gallipoli Campaign, 1915 to 1916. During World War I, the Allies attempted to open a new front by seizing the Dardanelles Strait in modern-day Turkey. The campaign, led by British and Anzac forces, was plagued by poor planning, inadequate intelligence, and underestimation of the Ottoman defenders. Landing forces faced steep cliffs and well-prepared enemy positions. The campaign dragged on for months, resulting in heavy casualties, over 250,000 for the Allies, without achieving its objectives. Gallipoli became a symbol of the cost of poor strategic planning and misjudging the enemy's capabilities. The Bay of Pigs invasion, 1961. In an attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro's government in Cuba, the United States supported an invasion by about 1,400 Cuban exiles. The operation assumed that local Cubans would rise up in support and that the Cuban military would collapse. Neither assumption proved true. The invading force was quickly surrounded and defeated by Cuban troops. The blunder embarrassed the U.S. government and strengthened Castro's position, highlighting the dangers of faulty intelligence and over-reliance on assumptions rather than facts. The Winter War miscalculation, 1939 to 1940. The Soviet Union expected an easy victory when it invaded Finland in 1939. The Red Army outnumbered the Finnish defenders by a wide margin. However, the Soviets underestimated the harsh terrain, extreme cold, and Finnish guerrilla tactics. Finnish troops, using skis and intimate knowledge of the landscape, inflicted heavy casualties on the Soviet forces. While the Soviets eventually won due to sheer numbers, their initial failures exposed weaknesses in their leadership and planning. The campaign showed how overconfidence and logistical neglect can turn an assumed easy victory into a costly struggle. The Battle of Dien Bien Phu, 1954. In an attempt to crush the Viet Minh forces during the First Indochina War, the French set up a fortified base at Dien Bien Phu, believing that their superior firepower and air support would dominate. However, the Viet Minh surrounded the base, hauled heavy artillery through rugged terrain, and launched a siege. French forces were trapped and eventually forced to surrender after weeks of intense fighting. This defeat ended French colonial rule in Indochina and set the stage for the Vietnam War. The blunder demonstrated the dangers of underestimating an opponent's determination and adaptability. The Battle of Isandlwana, 1879. During the Anglo-Zulu War, British forces underestimated the fighting abilities of the Zulu warriors. Believing their superior weapons and organization would ensure victory, they split their forces and failed to properly fortify their camp at Isandlwana. The Zulu army, using disciplined tactics and sheer numbers, overwhelmed the British in a surprise attack, inflicting one of the worst defeats on a European army by an indigenous force during the colonial period. It highlighted the importance of respecting the enemy and not taking battlefield superiority for granted. The failure of the Mannerheim Line assault, 1939 to 1940. Another example from the Winter War was the Soviet assault on Finland's Mannerheim Line, a series of defensive fortifications. Soviet commanders underestimated the strength of the defenses and launched frontal assaults in freezing weather without adequate preparation. The result was massive Soviet casualties in the early phases of the war. Only after months of reorganizing and using overwhelming force were they able to break through. This blunder underscores the consequences of poor planning and underestimating fortified defenses. Operation Market Garden, 1944. Allied forces during World War II launched Operation Market Garden with the aim of capturing bridges in the Netherlands and opening a route into Germany. The plan involved paratroopers seizing key bridges, followed by ground forces advancing rapidly. The operation underestimated German resistance, logistics were poorly coordinated, and the Allies failed to capture the final bridge at Arnhem. The failure delayed the Allied advance and prolonged the war in Europe. The blunder showed how overambitious plans can falter without thorough preparation. Closing perspective. Military history is full of examples where overconfidence, poor communication, bad intelligence, or logistical failures turned planned victories into costly defeats. These blunders are not just stories of failure, they are lessons. Each one shows how critical factors such as clear command structures, respect for the enemy, adequate supplies, and realistic planning are in the success of any military campaign. Learning from these mistakes has shaped modern military doctrine, improving logistics, intelligence gathering, and battlefield communication. These historical blunders serve as enduring reminders that even the most powerful armies can falter when hubris and misjudgment override careful strategy.